when Serafina Gonzalez threw 5 crisp $100 bills onto the tool cart of a grease-stained mechanic, she committed the most expensive miscalculation of her career. She saw a man in a struggling garage, an obstacle to be bought or bulldozed. She did not know that weeks later, in the dead of night, her billionaire father would pull his own car into that same dusty lot, not to seize the land. He came to place a gift worth $3.1 million into the hands of the man his daughter had once looked down upon. The game had officially changed hands in a way no one could have anticipated. Frank Allen's garage, sitting quietly on the outskirts of an Oregon suburb, was the kind of place that smelled of chemical solvent and old promises. Frank was 42. He had run the shop alone since his wife passed away 4 years ago. He operated on a margin so thin that despite working 10 hours a day, life for the father and daughter was never well off. But the concrete floor was swept. The tools were aligned with a precision that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with respect for the work. Hearing about it, you would think he was old-fashioned, perhaps lacking ambition, because he was the only mechanic in a 50-mile radius who would spend 3 hours rebuilding an alternator rather than charging a customer for a brand new one. Customers saw the heavy oil stains on his coveralls, but they rarely noticed the surgical care of his hands when he held a wrench. Genevieve was 10 years old, and she understood the rhythm of her father's life the way a sailor understands the tide. After school, she usually sat on a battered wooden bench in the corner of the shop. She did her homework while he worked. The soft scratch of her pencil erasing mistakes on loose-leaf paper blended with the sharp, metallic click of a socket wrench. It was a language they shared. She was his gravity. Everything Frank did, every patched tire and rebuilt transmission, was calibrated to keep her world steady, to ensure she never felt the absence of the things that mattered. The trouble arrived on a Saturday at noon, carrying the low, expensive hum of a German sports car. The vehicle pulled into the lot, radiating heat from a failing cooling system. The driver was Serafina Gonzalez. At 31, she was the chief financial officer of Gonzalez Dynamics, a woman accustomed to corporate boardrooms where people stopped speaking the moment she walked in. She stepped out of the car in elegant black shoes with red soles. She did not look at the shop. She looked through it. Frank skipped his lunch break. He worked for 2 straight hours, navigating the intricate, over-engineered housing of the sports car's cooling lines. It was a stuck thermostat valve, a problem most modern dealerships would use as an excuse to replace the entire radiator array. Frank diagnosed it by the sound of the hiss and the temperature of the upper hose. He flushed the system, cleared the blockage, and tested the pressure. When the car was running perfectly, he wiped his hands on a shop rag, walked to his small wooden podium, and printed a careful, itemized invoice, $285. A fair price, a price that reflected the honest labor, not the expensive badge on the hood. Serafina did not read the invoice. She pulled a money clip from her leather bag, separated 5 crisp $100 bills, and dropped them onto the metal tray of Frank's tool cart. "Keep it," she said. Her voice was perfectly smooth and entirely empty. Frank looked at the money. Then he looked at her. "The bill is $285, ma'am," he said, his tone even and unhurried. "I'll get your change." "I said keep it," she repeated. The implication sat heavy in the air between them. She was not tipping him for exceptional service. She was paying to end the interaction, purchasing her way out of having to acknowledge him as an equal. The 5 bills sat on the red metal of the cart, vividly green and crisp, utterly out of place among the scarred tools. She turned her back, walking toward her car with the absolute certainty of someone who believed every problem on earth had a price tag. Frank stood in the open bay doors, watching the dust settle on the asphalt. He felt the familiar, hot weight of humiliation pooling in his chest. His right hand closed into a hard fist at his side. He was a man who lived by an exact and quiet moral code, and his dignity had just been treated like a commodity to be bought and dismissed. Then a small hand touched his knuckles. Frank flinched slightly and looked down. Genevieve was standing beside him. She wasn't looking at the road, and she wasn't looking at the money on the cart. She was looking at him with the clear, uncomplicated gaze of a child who only knew him as the strongest thing in the world. "Can we eat lunch now, Dad?" she asked. Her voice was a quiet anchor in the suddenly too large space of the garage. "I want Lunchables." Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his shoulders released, millimeter by millimeter. He opened his hand, letting the frustration dissipate into the smell of motor oil and afternoon heat. He looked at his daughter, and the world narrowed back down to its proper, manageable size. "Yeah, Jen," he said softly. "Let's go eat." He reached for the bills and walked toward the gray metal desk, pulling out the drawer underneath, placing the $500 bills inside next to a thick, heavy old binder. The German sports car glided down the interstate with the flawless quiet of a machine that had just been perfectly repaired. Inside the cabin, Serafina Gonzalez did not think about the man who had fixed it. She thought only about the map. She pressed a button on the steering wheel, connecting a call to her executive assistant. The conversation lasted exactly 2 minutes. When it ended, a cold, sharp smile appeared in her rearview mirror. Frank Allen's garage was not merely a smudge of dirt in the middle of nowhere. It sat perfectly at the gateway of a rapidly developing township, directly adjacent to a major arterial highway. It was the exact geographic footprint Gonzales Dynamics needed for its flagship EV supercharger station. This station was meant to be the crown jewel of her new green infrastructure initiative, and completing this project would score her a perfect mark with Mr. Gonzales. To Serafina, Frank Allen was merely an obstacle to be cleared. That evening, an emergency after-hours meeting was called in Serafina's corner office on the 41st floor. The lights of the city spread out below them, a grid of power and capital. She stood before a digital presentation board and laid out the mechanism of the trap. She would not offer Frank a fair market buyout. That would imply he had leverage. Instead, she would engineer his ruin. She authorized a shell company to quietly purchase every outstanding county tax lien Frank had accumulated in the difficult years. Following his wife's death, she bought his debt. Then she weaponized the town council. Using the massive lobbying weight of Gonzales Dynamics, she sold the local politicians on a vision of a modernized, eco-friendly municipality. She made Frank's land the indispensable center of that vision. The strategy was brutally simple. They would present him with a lowball offer to buy the land. If he refused, the corporate attorneys would trigger a barrage of municipal environmental inspections. They would accuse him of leaking motor oil into the soil and improperly dumping industrial waste. In the corporate world, it was an accepted truth that old, struggling garages were ecological nightmares. The fines would bankrupt him. The town would seize the property, and she would take it without any significant resistance. It would smoothly execute the project while saving on compensation costs. She was proving to her father that she was the all-powerful heir he had always expected. 3 days later, the threat arrived in the hands of a courier in a crisp uniform who stepped into the smell of motor oil and handed Frank a thick, heavy envelope of premium stock paper. Frank stood by his workbench and broke the seal. He read the dense legal clauses. He read the purchase offer, which was insultingly low, and he read the threat heavily veiled in legal jargon. Sell by the end of the month or face catastrophic litigation for environmental negligence. They promised to leave him with nothing. Not the shop, not his livelihood, not the quiet security he had alone spent 4 years breaking his back to maintain for his daughter. They were banking an assumption. They assumed that a man in oil-stained coveralls, a man who drove an old truck and counted his pennies, was a man who cut corners. They assumed he poured used fluids down the drain when no one was looking to save every dollar for his daughter's doll. Frank finished reading. The shop was quiet. He did not shout, showing little emotion. He simply folded the document, placed it on his gray metal workbench. The handle on the bottom drawer was chipped, but when he pulled it, the drawer slid outward with absolute silence. He maintained the tracks himself. Inside, there was no clutter. There were no loose papers. There was a thick, heavy binder, its spine labeled with the black marker, and the stack of 5 crisp, new $100 bills beside it. Frank opened it. Inside the binder was a meticulous, unbroken chronology of compliance. Every single month, a specialized hazard disposal truck backed into Frank's lot. Every ounce of used 10W30, Every drop of transmission fluid, every rag soaked in chemical solvent was catalogued, sealed in specialized drums, and hauled away by a certified environmental company. It was a service that cost Frank hundreds of dollars a month. It was money he desperately needed. It meant eating generic soup instead of roast beef. It meant wearing boots until the soles wore through. But Frank understood chemicals, and he possessed a professional ethic that did not change simply because no one was watching. He did not pollute the ground his daughter walked on. His conscience was entirely clean. More importantly, it was perfectly documented. He traced his calloused finger over the crisp edge of a receipt from 3 years ago. Serafina Gonzalez thought she was dealing with a careless grease monkey. She did not know she was threatening a man who kept his professional ethics the way other men kept their religion. The bell above the garage door chimed, breaking the silence. Frank looked up as Martha Gable walked in. She was 72, wore a thin black long-sleeved sweater regardless of the weather, and carried a round tin that smelled warmly of vanilla and butter. She was the neighbor who kept a watchful eye on Genevieve when the shop got busy. "I brought sugar cookies," Martha called out, her voice cheerful, cutting through the heavy atmosphere of the garage. "Is Genevieve doing her fractions yet?" Frank looked up from the desk, his expression heavier than usual. Martha stopped. She looked at his face, and then she looked at the thick legal document resting on the workbench. The cheerful set of her shoulders dropped. She set the tin of cookies down next to the legal document and picked up the papers. She read the first page. She did not need to read the rest. She had lived in this town her whole life, and she knew what it looked like when money decided it wanted something. Martha looked up at Frank. Her eyes, usually soft behind her wire-rimmed glasses, were suddenly fierce. "They think you're going to roll over," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held the solid weight of poured concrete. "They think because you're quiet, you're weak." Frank looked at the floor. "They have lawyers, Martha. They have power. They're threatening to take it all." "Let them threaten," Martha said, stepping closer, tapping her index finger hard against the legal document. "This town doesn't belong to the wealthy. It's our home. Don't you let them bully you, Frank. Don't you dare let them invade the peace you built here. You are not alone in this." The words hung in the air, smelling faintly of motor oil and sweet vanilla. Frank looked at the elderly woman standing in his defense. He thought of his daughter, sitting on her wooden bench every afternoon, trusting that the roof over her head would always hold. He thought of his binder. Frank reached out and took the papers back from Martha. The tension in his jaw hardened into something new. It was not fear anymore. It was the quiet, immovable resolve of a man who realized exactly where the load-bearing walls of his life stood, and who had just decided he would not let anyone tear them down. "No," Frank said, his voice perfectly steady. "I won't." The corporate machine had calculated every possible variable of his ruin, except the one that mattered most, the fact that a man with nothing to hide is the most dangerous kind of man to corner. Martha left, leaving the garage to its usual quiet. At this moment, Genevieve sat on her wooden bench, hovering a small hand over the tin Martha had left. She was caught in the serious, silent deliberation of a 10-year-old choosing between a star-shaped sugar cookie and a perfectly round one. "Why didn't Mrs. Martha wait for me? Is she in a hurry or something?" She mumbled to herself, more talking to herself than needing an answer from her dad. Frank watched her. He looked at her small shoulders and the dusting of sugar on her fingertips. He knew he was right. He knew his disposal logs were flawless. But he also understood the cold reality of Serafina Gonzalez's world. In her world, the truth was only a technicality. Power was the currency, and Frank had none. He pulled out his phone, opening the camera app on it. He opened the security footage from last Saturday. He found the exact timestamp, clipped the video of the young executive throwing $500 bills onto his tool cart, and saved it. He did not want to use it. But a man building a wall against a flood does not throw away sandbags. He needed the town. When he explained to Genevieve that they needed to ask the neighbors for help, he suggested that she spend more time at Mrs. Martha's house, because he needed time to go convince others. She listened to her father intently, and then smiled and ran up to her bedroom. A few minutes later, Genevieve returned with a small ceramic piggy bank. smiling mischievously. "Time to say goodbye to piggy bank. Let's practice fractions." 1/4 teaspoon, 3/4 cup. While Frank stood there stunned, not understanding a thing, Genevieve declared they were going to bake. They went to the supermarket as the sun set over the pines. That night, the small kitchen above the garage was entirely alive. The rich, sweet smell of baking classic chocolate chip cookies overwhelmed the sharp scent of the chicken stir-fry Frank was cooking for their dinner. Genevieve sat at the table with a spool of cheap ribbon. She carefully tied uneven, lopsided bows around dozens of small plastic bags of cookies. She wanted to give one to everybody, but there weren't many cookies. They just hoped to give them to as many people as possible. Frank washed the baking sheets and watched her, his heart aching with the fierce protective love of a father who knows his child is trying to save their home. The next morning they hit the pavement. Frank drove a 2-mile radius around the garage. Frank knocked on doors he hadn't approached in years. His busy life rarely allowed him to leave the garage. To the older folks who knew him, he offered a warm smile, a small bag of Genevieve's cookies, and a clipboard holding a petition. They signed gladly. They knew Frank. They knew his quiet dignity. They patted Genevieve on the head, and some even gave her a few wild blackberries from their garden. But not everyone was a friend. Some neighbors were hesitant. They did not want to stand in the way of progress. They did not want to fight a billion-dollar company. For them, Frank did not talk about his livelihood. He talked about their backyards. "Do you want heavy concrete trucks idling outside your bedroom window at 2 in the morning?" Frank asked a man in a pristine polo shirt. "Do you want the LED glare of a 24-hour supercharger station shining through your living room curtains every night for the rest of your life?" he said to a middle-aged lady who looked immaculate. Frank took their quiet, suburban desire for peace and weaponized it. He turned the neighborhood's fear of disruption into a shield against corporate overreach. It worked. A week after the petition began circulating, the town council bowed to the sudden pressure and announced a public hearing. It was scheduled for a Thursday night, 15 days away. Then a spark caught fire. Jim, a young man from the other side of town, took the security footage Frank had shared with a few locals and posted it online. He added a simple caption telling people to look at the true face of the Gonzalez Dynamics executive. The video was stark. It was entirely unarguable. It showed wealth treating labor like dirt. The internet did what it always does with arrogance caught on tape. The video went viral. By Wednesday morning, the local community group chat Frank had started swelled to 200 people. The phone in Frank's pocket buzzed constantly with messages of support, angry emojis, and promises to pack the town hall. For a few hours, Frank stood in his garage and felt a surge of genuine, unfamiliar hope. The truth was out. People were listening. He was not invisible anymore. But Serafina Gonzalez was not a woman who allowed herself to be embarrassed without consequence. She did not panic. She opened her checkbook. Behind closed doors, corporate representatives quietly reached out to the re-election campaigns of 3 key town councilmen. Assurances were made. Funds were promised. And they reached out to Jim. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Frank opened his phone to check the comments on the video. The screen flashed gray. Content unavailable. Frank frowned. He dialed Jim's number. It rang 3 times and went to voicemail. He dialed again. The call was rejected immediately. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the bottom of Frank's stomach. 10 minutes later, the screen of his phone lit up with a single automated notification from the community group chat. Jim has left the group. The buzzing of the phone stopped. The sudden, suffocating quiet of the garage returned. The glimmer of a fair fight vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Frank to realize that a machine with infinite money does not argue with its obstacles, it simply buys them. The next day, Frank had gone to buy milk and cereal for his daughter. He turned the corner past the canned goods and saw Jim. The young man was holding a basket, but the moment he made eye contact with Frank, he froze. Jim set the basket down on the floor, turned on his heel, and walked quickly toward the exit. Frank left his cart. He followed Jim out the automatic doors and caught him in the parking lot. He did not grab the younger man. He simply stood in front of him and asked why the video was gone. Jim looked at the asphalt. He could not meet Frank's eyes. He shifted his weight, his voice tight and defensive. "They offered me a job, Frank, full benefits at the new station once it's built. They said if I took the video down, I was in." Jim finally looked up, his a mixture of guilt and grim resignation. "We can't beat them. They have all the money. They have the power. I have rent to pay." Frank looked at the young man. He felt a sudden, profound exhaustion settle into his bones. He was not angry. He was heartbroken. "I don't believe that, Jim," Frank said quietly, "and the people who signed that petition don't believe it either." Jim shook his head. "They will when the lawyers show up," he said, and walked to his car. Frank watched him drive away. He walked back into the store, paid for his items, and drove home in silence. That night, paranoia set in. It trickled into the house like cold air through a cracked window. Frank placed his phone on the kitchen counter. He stared at it. He opened the community group chat. The number at the top of the screen read 199. He checked it before he brushed his teeth. He checked it while the coffee brewed the next morning. He checked it in the quiet space of the garage while he worked on a transmission. Every time the screen illuminated, he braced himself for the number to drop. The feeling of isolation began to close around his throat. He felt as though the entire town was quietly stepping backward into the shadows, leaving him alone under a spotlight. Martha and a few of the older neighbors still sent small, bright emojis of support, but the heavy metallic dread in Frank's chest did not lift. The town was his foundation. If the foundation crumbled, he and Genevieve would fall. In the heart of the city, in a corner office on the 63rd floor, Alistair Gonzalez sat in silence. Billionaire founder of Gonzalez Dynamics did not have family photographs on his desk. He had a single black-framed document positioned near his right hand. It was a canceled bank check from 1982, simply rejected. It was the artifact of his beginning. It was the proof of a time when the world had looked at him and seen a worthless risk. His secretary stood quietly by the door. She had just delivered the morning briefing. She explained the viral video, the sudden drop in the company's stock price, and Serafina's aggressive, scorched-earth tactics to silence the local opposition. Alistair looked out the floor-to-ceiling window. "Keep monitoring the situation." Alistair told his secretary, his voice low and carrying the gravel of a man who had built an empire with his own hands. "Tell me exactly what happens at that hearing." For Serafina, the dropping stock price was an insult. The video had embarrassed her in front of the board. Her arrogance calcified into absolute rage. She no longer just wanted the land. She wanted Frank Allen erased from the map. She instructed her legal team to prepare every filing necessary to bury him by Friday morning. Thursday arrived, the day of the hearing. Frank closed the garage at noon. He could not focus on engines. He paced the worn floorboards of his living room. He held a legal pad filled with crossed-out sentences and rewritten pleas. He spent the entire afternoon speaking to an empty room. He rehearsed his words, his voice catching in the quiet house. He imagined the polished corporate lawyers in their expensive suits. He imagined the town council members looking down at him from their elevated desks. He imagined the sheer, crushing weight of $1 billion pressing against the chest of a single father, holding nothing but a binder of receipts. When Genevieve came home from school, he made her dinner. He smiled, he checked her homework, and when he went to the bathroom to wash his face, he looked in the mirror, gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, and realized he was entirely terrified. The machinery of ruin had been perfectly assembled, waiting only for a quiet man to finally break under the weight of his own isolation. The municipal building was a low, brick structure built in the 1970s, entirely unaccustomed to spectacle. At 6 o'clock on Thursday evening, Serafina Gonzalez arrived expecting exactly that. She stepped out of the back of a black town car, wearing a charcoal suit hand-tailored by a famous tailor whose schedule was always fully booked. Following her was her assistant, who carried a leather briefcase. Serafina's expression carried the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who had purchased the battlefield before the war even began. She knew about Jim's defection. She assumed the rest of the town had fractured with him. But she was wrong. The front steps of the town hall were not empty. They were packed. Nearly 100 local residents stood shoulder to shoulder in the cooling evening air. They held pieces of cardboard and neon poster board written in thick black marker. No supercharger. Protect our living space. Serafina looked at them. The confident smile on her face thinned, losing its absolute edge. She could buy a few young people who had stumbled. She could fund the campaigns of 3 councilmen. She could not sue 100 citizens simultaneously without creating a public relations disaster. Father would not forgive. Inside the chamber, the air was hot and thick. Frank stood at the front podium. He placed his heavy black binder of environmental disposal receipts onto the wooden stand and opened it. He showed the council the unblemished record of a man who had done everything right. Behind him, the room was a solid, breathing wall of his neighbors. The council members looked at Frank's flawless documentation. Then they looked out at the 200 angry eyes of the people who elected them. A political calculation happened in real time. Corporate funding was useful, but it could not protect them from a unified voting public. The politicians folded. The zoning variance was denied. The environmental inquiry was dismissed. Serafina Gonzalez sat in the front row, entirely silent, watching a local mechanic with grease beneath his fingernails dismantle a multi-million-dollar acquisition with nothing but a binder and the truth. An hour later, the local diner smelled of fried onions, old coffee, and sudden, overwhelming relief. The bell above the door rang constantly as people crammed into the empty tables. Mr. and Mrs. Psoff, couple who lived 2 streets over from Frank, stood by the register and announced they were paying for everyone's food and coffee. Laughter bounced off the linoleum floors. People clapped Frank on the shoulder as they walked past. Frank sat in a corner booth, the heavy tension of the past month slowly draining from his spine. Genevieve sat beside him, swinging her glass beneath for juice. She was smiling, her teeth showing, watching the room treat her father the way she had always seen him. Frank smiled back, looking around the diner once. Jim had not come. By 9 o'clock, the noise became too much for the 10-year-old. Frank thanked the Thompsons, gathered his coat, and slipped out the back door. Martha Gable met them on the sidewalk. The walk home was quiet. The night air was sharp and clean. Genevieve held Martha's hand on one side and Frank's on the other, skipping occasionally over the cracks in the pavement. For the first time in weeks, Frank did not feel the crushing weight of the sky pressing down on his garage. The town had held. He was safe. They turned the final corner onto Frank's street. The yellow security light above the garage bay was on, casting a pale, circular glow over the cracked asphalt. Parked directly beneath the light was a vehicle that did not belong here. It was a sleek, impeccably polished luxury sedan idling. A young man in a dark tailored suit stood perfectly still beside the rear passenger door. Frank stopped. The familiar, cold spike of dread returned to his chest. He tightened his grip on Genevieve's hand. He looked at Martha, his voice dropping to a low, protective register. "Martha, take Jen to your house. I'll come get her when I'm done here." Martha looked at the car, her eyes narrowing with worry, but she said nothing. She nodded slightly, gently turning Genevieve by the shoulders, and hurried the girl down the darker tree-lined path toward her own porch. Frank waited until he saw the grandmother and granddaughter disappear behind the trees. Then he turned and walked toward the car. As he approached, the young man in the suit reached out and opened the rear door. The man who stepped out of the vehicle was not a lawyer. He was in his late 60s. He did not wear a suit. He wore a faded gray field jacket, a cream was unbuttoned at a collar, and a pair of dark chinos. On his feet were heavy leather work boots, scuffed at the toes and entirely unpolished. He looked around the lot, taking in the small building, the neatly stacked tires, the clean concrete of the driveway. Then he looked at Frank. "Mr. Allen," the man said. His voice was gravelly, carrying a quiet, effortless, natural weight. "I am Alistair Gonzalez." Frank stopped. He looked at the billionaire founder of Gonzalez Dynamics, a man whose net worth exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations. He looked at the unpolished boots. "Congratulations on your victory tonight," Alistair said. "It was hard fought, and it was deserved." Frank did not say thank you. He stood his ground. "Did you come here to find a different way to take my shop, Mr. Gonzalez?" Alistair smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "I would like very much to see your shop, Frank, if you'll permit me." Frank hesitated. The man's demeanor was entirely at odds with the ruthless woman who had spent the last month trying to ruin him. Frank pulled the heavy ring of keys from his pocket, unlocked the side door, and turned on the overhead fluorescent lights. They flickered twice before holding steady, illuminating the tools, the lift, and the meticulously clean floor. Frank pulled 2 metal folding chairs from the corner. They were old, and the edges of the seats carried the faint, indelible shadow of motor oil. He offered one to Alistair, expecting the billionaire to remain standing. Alistair sat down immediately. He did not check the seat. He rested his forearms on his knees, and as his sleeve pulled back, Frank noticed the watch on his left wrist. It was not a Swiss luxury timepiece. It was an old, silver-banded Seiko. The glass face was lightly scratched. "My daughter," Alistair began, staring out at the floor of the garage, "understands spreadsheets. She understands growth projections and leverage. She is very intelligent. But she has spent her entire life in the penthouse, and she has forgotten how the foundation is built." Alistair looked at Frank, his eyes locking onto the mechanics. "I read your file, Frank. I saw the security footage. I saw your hazard disposal logs. A man who pays a premium to properly dispose of his waste when he is struggling to pay his back taxes is a man of profound integrity. When my daughter gave you excess money, you refused it. When she threatened to bury you, you dug in. You held the line." Frank sat opposite, listening to the quiet cadence of the older man's voice. He felt a strange, shifting realization. Alistair Gonzalez was not looking at him as an adversary. He was looking at him as an equal. "For what my company put you through," Alistair said. The apology was direct and unadorned. "But I did not come here just to apologize. I came because you are exactly the kind of man this company needs to partner with." Frank frowned. "Partner with?" Alistair reached toward the young man accompanying him and received a file that was thinner than what his daughter had ever sent here. "This is an agreement worth $3.1 million. But I do not want an EV station here. I want a high-tech vocational training center." Frank stared at the folder in Mr. Gonzalez's hand. "You have the trust of this community," Alistair continued. "You have the mechanical brilliance. I have the capital. We build it right here. We expand the lot. You run the program. You teach the local kids. You give them a trade. You give them a certificate, and my company guarantees them a job when they graduate." Alistair paused, and a fierce, bright light flickered in his eyes. "The kids in this town who think they have to take the first bad deal they are offered because they don't have power. You teach them differently, because the kids need it, Frank." He handed the folder to Frank. Frank took it. He thought of his garage. He thought of the long, exhausting years of scraping by. And then he thought of Jim. He thought of the young mechanic standing in the grocery store aisle, his shoulders slumped, selling out his own town because he was terrified of being poor. If Jim had a guaranteed path, a trade that demanded respect, he would never have folded. Frank thought of Genevieve. He thought of the future of the land where she would grow up. Frank gripped the papers in his hand. He looked at Alistair Gonzalez. "Okay," Frank said quietly. "We build it." Alistair stood up. He reached out a weathered hand. Frank took it. The grip was firm, calloused, and exact. "This is Secretary Brown," Alistair said, gesturing to the young man in the suit who had been quietly standing behind him the whole time. "He will be your direct contact. Whatever you need, he will facilitate." Alistair walked back to the car. Frank stood in the doorway of the garage and watched the heavy door close. The engine hummed silently and the car pulled out of the lot, disappearing down the dark, tree-lined street. The garage was quiet again. Frank stood beneath the yellow porch light, looking at his hands. He had won. The town was safe. His daughter's future was secured. But as he looked at the empty asphalt, he felt a strange, sudden hollowness in his chest, the quiet, lingering ache of a man who realizes the simple life he had fought so hard to protect was already gone. Midnight on the 63rd floor of the Gonzalez Dynamics Tower, the ambient noise of the city did not reach this high. The glass was too thick. The air was perfectly filtered, perfectly cooled, and entirely still. Serafina Gonzalez sat rigid in a low-backed leather chair opposite her father's desk. She had been instructed to wait here. She had not been permitted to make a phone call, consult her legal team, or review the stock ticker. A glass of water sat on the polished mahogany in front of her. The condensation had long since gathered and dripped onto the coaster. She had not touched it. At midnight, the heavy oak door opened. Alistair Gonzalez walked into the office. He did not look at his daughter. He walked past her, his heavy, unpolished work boots sinking slightly into the luxury carpet, and took his seat behind the desk. He placed a single manila folder on the wood. The silence stretched. It was not a comfortable quiet. It was a heavy, pressurized silence. When Alistair finally spoke, his voice was low and perfectly measured. $3.1 million. Serafina blinked. The absolute certainty that had defined her for 31 years wavered. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, but the cold look in her father's eyes stopped the words in her throat. "You did not lose because the town was loud," Alistair said. "You lost because you tried to purchase compliance from a man whose integrity was better documented than your own shell companies. You mistook a quiet man for a weak one, and in doing so, you traded the clean reputation of this corporation for a viral video of an executive throwing money at a worker." Serafina looked down at her hands. The humiliation was absolute because it was accurate. She had spent her youth learning how to exploit leverage, but she had never learned how to recognize honor. She had cost the company millions in market valuation. "I am authorizing the funding for a vocational training center on his land," Alistair continued. "Frank Allen will run it. He will hold the title of Senior Director of Technical Education, and you, Serafina, will be his liaison." Her head snapped up. "Me? You," Alistair said. The word fell like a gavel. "You will ensure every permit is filed properly. You will make sure that every tool, every lift, and every piece of diagnostic equipment he requests is delivered. You will answer to him on this project. You will build the very thing you tried to pave over. That is how you will earn back the right to SIS building." Serafina understood. It was not merely a demotion. It was a forced rehabilitation. She had relied entirely on power. Now she would have to rely on humility. She nodded once, the sharp edge of her arrogance finally broken against the weight of her father's judgment. "Go home," Alistair told her. "Sleep. Tomorrow you have a center to build. You will need to work twice as hard to repair what you broke." Serafina stood, her posture straight but stripped of its former entitlement, and walked out of the office. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. Alistair remained at his desk. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the framed, cancelled check from 1982. He had spoken the truth to his daughter, but he had not spoken the entirety of it. "And I am still here, guiding you," Alistair said quietly to the empty room. He liked Frank Allen. He respected him deeply. But Alistair Gonzalez had not built a multi-billion-dollar empire on sentiment alone. Frank was an honorable man, but he was also a highly effective, incredibly dangerous populist symbol. A symbol that had just galvanized 200 people and paralyzed a corporate acquisition. By investing $3 million, Alistair had not just funded a school. He had purchased the symbol. He had transformed Dynamics from a corporate villain into a local benefactor. He had erased his daughter's mistake, secured the region's goodwill, and placed Frank Allen firmly within the corporate ecosystem. Frank was no longer a rogue variable. He was a supervised asset. The empire was safe. Miles away, at the edge of a quiet, sleeping suburb, the yellow porch light of the garage burned steadily against the dark. Frank Allen stood outside his secured shop, running his hand over the heavy padlock he had snapped shut earlier. He stood in the cool night air and looked at the small, worn building. He breathed in the faint scent of motor oil and pine needles. He did not know about the corporate chess match that had just concluded on the 63rd floor of a glass tower. What he knew was that tomorrow, the threat of eviction would be gone. The legal letters would stop. What he knew was that a young kid named Jim, who had compromised his own morals because he was terrified of poverty, was going to get a second chance to learn a trade with dignity. Genevieve's world was safe. Her home was intact. She would grow up watching her father not as a man who was bullied into a corner, but as a man who stood his ground and built something that would outlast them both. Frank put his hands in the pockets of his jacket. He looked out at the empty road lit by the pale glow of the street lamps. The intense, suffocating pressure of the last month was gone, replaced by a quiet, expansive peace. His life of profound isolation was over. Everything was about to change. He smiled, turned his back to the road, and walked up the wooden stairs to his home. He was just a father at the end of a long day, lit from within, knowing the roof over his daughter's head was finally made of iron.